So today I'm going to talk a little bit about science and food, and then we're going to talk about steak. So, okay, so if you all think back to your hometown, like the town that you grew up in, you're probably, at this point in your life, you're probably very familiar, even if you don't live there anymore, you could probably be dropped back in there and know where you are, you know where the streets are, you know where the shops are, you know how to navigate from one place to another. But nobody is born knowing that, right? That's a process that you learn over time. Like maybe your mom walks you to school and you learn that route, and then maybe one day one of those roads is closed and you take a slightly different route, and you sort of develop this mental map, or sometimes maybe even a drawn map of the place where you are. And so as time goes on, you become more and more able to adapt to situations there. So when roads do close, or when you need to try it, or when your favorite dry cleaner is closed and you need to find another place, you probably already have an idea of where that secondary backup dry cleaner is. And you know, the process through which you learn this mapping, to me, it's very similar to the way in which people traditionally learn cooking. You know, nobody's born knowing how to cook. We all learn how to cook by probably following what our parents did, maybe what our mother did, what our grandmother did. Maybe you learned a couple of your father's recipes. Maybe you're a professional and you learn from a chef. But you start off by imitation. You start by walking. You know, somebody's holding your hand and they're taking you on that one path to get from here to there. And then, you know, if you're really into cooking, you might start straying from that path a little bit and sort of feeling out what works and what doesn't work. And over time, you know, a really good cook, whether it's a really good home cook or a really good chef, will eventually get to the point where they have like this sort of great mental map of how ingredients interact with each other and how they interact chemically, and how heat and how acids and things, how all these things affect the different ingredients, so that they can then decide, if I'm starting here, how do I get to there, and figure it out on their own. And that's sort of what, you know, that is sort of what food science is to me. So there's different ways you can get to that mental map. There is the traditional way where you slowly fill it in over time, and then there's the way where someone can just hand you a map and say, hey, like, here's the map, look at it. And you know, so I grew up in a family. My mother was a Japanese immigrant. My father was American. We didn't really have like a food culture in my house. Like, we didn't have family recipes. My mom, she moved to the U.S. when she was 16, so she didn't learn very many traditional Japanese recipes at that point. So we didn't have traditional Japanese food. My dad didn't really cook, so we didn't have traditional American food. So most of the stuff that we ate growing up was things that my mom learned out of cookbooks like Betty Crocker and Joy of Cooking, things like that. And that's what we learned growing up. So we didn't really have these family recipes. I didn't really learn how to cook in that way that I think a lot of people who are maybe, I wouldn't say luckier, but a lot of people who grew up in a family with these family traditions were able to learn how to cook. And I think, you know, I don't think I'm unique in that situation, particularly I think in this generation where, and maybe a couple generations before, where both parents are working, for example. Kids grew up in these families that don't have these food traditions and don't learn how to cook, don't learn that map through the more traditional methods. And so, you know, what's somebody like me, or what's somebody, you know, like anyone else my age or maybe older or younger, supposed to do about that? And for me, that's where learning the science comes in. That's where for me it's like I want this map. I want someone to draw this map for me and show me what all these connections are. And it's, you know, if you look at like a traditional recipe book or just a recipe, you know, a recipe to me is like a step-by-step, turn-by-turn direction to get from point A to point B. It's like you have your phone out and you're just looking at it and you're like, okay, I'm at this intersection, now I'm going to turn here, now I'm going to turn here, and you arrive where it says you're supposed to arrive, usually. And it gets better and better. It depends if you're using Google Maps or Apple Maps, but it's turn-by-turn direction. So it'll get you from your starting point to your ending point. But it doesn't help you deal with new situations, and it also doesn't help you express yourself as a cook or as a map follower. So you know, so what happens if you know, you don't want to go to exactly that location? What happens if you want to find something in a general area? How do you get there? Well, that's where having that map and seeing, like having a blown back perspective and being able to see everything around you helps you. So that's the main reason why I decided to start writing this book. You know, my background was in science. My father was a scientist, my grandfather was a scientist, and my education was all very strong in math, science, and engineering. And that's what I was supposed to be. I mean, you know, I was going to be a biologist. I kind of broke my mom's heart sophomore year in college when I told her I was switching from biology to architecture because architecture is not, I guess, not like a hard science. And then it completely destroyed her. 3 years later, when I graduated, I told her I was becoming a cook. I mean, she still hasn't accepted that I'm a cook. She still thinks I'm going to become a doctor or a lawyer or a scientist someday. But so I loved science. I got a little bit disillusioned with biology because it turns out that as much as I love science, I really hate lab work. I don't know how many lab scientists there are here, but it can be mind-numbing, and thank you to all of you people who do it, and I'm sure some of you actually love doing it. It just wasn't for me. And so the summer after my sophomore year, I basically decided to take the summer off. Ended up looking for a job as a waiter, but ended up actually being a cook instead because one of the restaurants I walked into said, "We have a line cook who didn't show up this morning. Can you hold a knife and can you come in this afternoon?" And I said yes and yes. And I was lying about one of those two things that I'd never never held a knife in my life before. But I faked it. Oops. See. That was not intentional. But I faked it, and it turned out, I really loved cooking. And so I continued doing it part-time through college, went into it full-time after graduating. I remember, did I just shut everything off? Oh, no, we're not there yet. One of my first restaurant jobs, I was working on the pasta station and the fryer station, and one of my jobs was to par cook the French fries. And if you know how traditional French fries are made, you boil them once, fry them once at a relatively low temperature, and then fry them again at a higher temperature just before serving them, and that makes them really nice and crispy, much crispier than if you just fry them once. And so I asked the chef, why do we do that? And the chef said, well, the first fry is to cook them through to the center. The second fry is to get them crispy, which it turns out is not the case. But I asked him, okay, so if the first fry is just to cook them through to the center, why do we have to adjust the flame on the fryer halfway through the day? Because it was a pain in the butt to change the temperature of 20 gallons of oil a couple times during the day. I was like, why can't we just boil the French fries for the first step and then fry them for the second step? Won't they come out the same if the only point is that we're trying to cook them? And then his answer was stop asking questions. But that's a response you get a lot, I think, in restaurant kitchens, because the goal of a restaurant is very different from the goal of a recipe developer or a food scientist. A restaurant's goal is, all right, we have this method that works. We're going to do it, and you're going to do it that way because we already know it works. So that, we don't have the time to experiment. We don't have the time to mess around. We don't have the time to maybe accidentally end up doing something that's not going to work because we've just wasted all those potatoes. So if we know it works this way, we're going to do it that way, and that's the end of the story. So over the course of my time in restaurants, though I started keeping track of all these questions I had, and it turns out there's a lot of them. And so eventually, I thought to myself, if I ever get out of restaurants, maybe I'll try seeing what the answers to these questions are. So luckily, I thought I was going to just do it on my own. Luckily, I ended up seeing an advertisement for a job at Cooks Illustrated magazine, which I hadn't really heard of at the time, actually. But I started working there, and it was perfect because it's I realized, I can make a living doing these two things that I actually really enjoy doing. I've been doing that basically ever since then. I started writing my column, The Food Lab, a few years after that when I moved back to New York. My very first column was about hard-boiled eggs, and it was. I remember I was sitting in a cafe in New York with Ed Levine, the founder of Serious Eats, and he told me. He said, you should write a food science column. I was like, okay, I'll write a food science column. And he said, get me something next week. And I was like, okay. So I went home and boiled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of eggs, and then wrote thousands of words about boiling eggs. And for me, it was I was always just this is a lot of fun. I'm just kind of indulging myself. I'm boiling eggs and I'm writing way too much, which are two things that I enjoy doing. And I thought, it was going to get edited down. And then it didn't. It just got published as is. And then it turned out that people like reading thousands of words about boiled eggs. Since then, I've written 2 more articles which are thousands of words about boiled eggs, and it never gets old to people. I don't know why. So yeah. Okay. So why science? Well, we do science because it helps us understand the universe around us, and it helps us figure out how to get from point A to point B, or point A prime to point B prime, or wherever you want to go, in a way that is very different from just following a recipe. And there are different ideas about what science is. I think there are some people, maybe even some people in this audience, who are of the mind that unless science is at a certain level of rigor, unless like we're doing real science, then it's not real science. I call those science snobs. There obviously are different levels of rigor with science. Science you do in a laboratory, science that you get published in a scientific a journal is much more rigorous than the type of science we generally do in the kitchen. But that doesn't mean that what you do in the kitchen is not science. In my book, I talk about an example of science that you've probably all done at home, which is when you get a new toaster, you don't know how powerful that toaster is. Not every toaster's 5 setting is the same. So you put in a slice of toast the first day, and you set it to 5, because that's what your old toaster gave you perfect toast for, and you find out, oh, this is too dark. And then you think to yourself, okay, maybe I'll try it at 3. And you try it at 3, and it comes out too light, and eventually you lock it into number 4. And that is doing science. You're isolating one variable, you're keeping track of your results, you're making a prediction, and then you're testing this hypothesis and coming to, well, in this case, a useful conclusion, because now you have perfect toast. And that's the kind of science that I think, that's obviously a very, very low example of the type of things you can do with science. But that's the kind of answers you can get by actually thinking a little bit methodically about what you're doing in the kitchen. So what I'm going to talk about now is steak, because it's something that, it's one of these things where there are just tons and tons of folklore about steak. I think, I'm not sure exactly why. I feel like steak and Italian food are the two things that people get most upset about when you question them on. The Italian thing I can't explain. The steak thing, I think it's maybe because steak is one of those foods that are, and I don't want to, and I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but I think it's one of these foods that, like, traditionally men who don't always cook it a couple times a year, and it's like the thing that they own. And they don't want to be wrong about it. So there are these, steak just has this like a lot of myths surrounding it. And so I'm going to go through a number of these myths and talk about maybe why they started, and then talk about why they're wrong. Well, this is not a steak. This is prime rib, but it's very similar to a steak. So this is a prime rib. A prime rib and a ribeye steak are essentially the same thing, just cut in a different way. So if you if I'm a steer, this is my spine, my rib cage here. The prime rib comes from up here, ribs 7 through 12, and the muscle back here on a steer is not used very much. It doesn't get a lot of exercise because their shoulders, their legs, their neck, those get a lot of exercise. The back muscles don't get much. And with beef, and in fact with almost all meat, there's an inverse relationship between how tough a muscle is and how much work it gets throughout its lifetime. I'm sorry, a direct relationship between how tough a muscle is and how worked it is. And also. And that's why these back muscles, the loin and the tenderloin, which runs on the inside of the spine, tend to be the most tender muscles, and why they're the most sought after for steaks. So this is a prime rib. It's the loin muscle here along the back of the longissimus dorsi, cut off the steer. And if we were to slice this into inch thick things, then it becomes a ribeye steak. Myth number 1. So this one you hear a lot from chefs on TV. You read it in books. Resting a steak at room temperature for 20 to 30 minutes before cooking it is going to make it sear better. It's going to make it cook more evenly. It's going to make it more tender. And the logic to this, actually, it makes a little bit of sense. So when you have a piece of meat and you're searing it, you're applying very high heat to the exterior of it. And in general, not just in general, always. The higher the higher the temperature that you're cooking at, the bigger the temperature gradient you're going to develop inside, and also the further away from your final temperature, from the heat. The further away the starting temperature of the thing you're cooking is from the heat from the temperature that you're applying to it. Also, the bigger gradient you're going to get. So the colder the steak is, the bigger a temperature gradient you're going to get when you start searing it. Intuitively, this makes sense. You know, if you have a frozen steak, you start searing it from the outside. The middle's still going to be frozen by the time that the outside is browned. Whereas if you have a steak that's already at like 120 degrees, which is the temperature that you generally serve like a rare steak at, maybe 130 degrees for medium rare, by searing the outside, you're going to have a very even temperature throughout the inside. So it sort of makes sense that if you take a steak out of the fridge, if it's at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, you take it out of the fridge, you let it sit at room temperature, 65, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes. The temperature is going to rise a little bit, it's going to cook more evenly, and it's going to sear better. Here's the problem. Okay, so a cast iron pan, or any kind of like a steel griddle, whatever you're going to sear your steak in, it's like a bucket. It's like a bucket for storing energy, and your burner is like the tap. So the tap on a regular home burner is a relatively slow tap. It's kind of a steady trickle. And this is why you want to have a heavy cast iron pan, because you want to be able to store as much energy as possible in it before you add that steak, because that energy is what's going to cook the steak. So where does the energy in this bucket go? There's three different places where it goes. There's changing the temperature. So that is bringing up the temperature of the meat. There is browning, so the Maillard reaction, the thing that makes the meat tasty, flavorful. And then there's, well, I wrote evaporation, but it's evaporation. Well, I probably should have talked about this before I showed the graph, but evaporation is by far the biggest bucket. To put it in perspective, it takes about 50 times more energy to evaporate one drop of water than it does to raise that same drop of water from 0 degrees Celsius to 100 degrees Celsius. It's a huge amount more energy to evaporate that moisture than it is to raise the temperature. So in fact, the starting temperature of the steak, particularly the outside of the steak where you're going to be searing it, the starting temperature actually has very, very little bearing on how fast it browns. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So the way these play out in real life, you're going to start by raising the temperature of the beef. You need to get that liquid on the surface up to the boiling point of water. I'll stick with Fahrenheit the whole time. You need to get it up to 212 degrees. Then the next thing that happens is that you hit a plateau. It can't go above 212 degrees until the water has evaporated off, until that surface moisture has evaporated off. So then you get to evaporation, and then finally you can progress to browning. And browning is what you're really after, because that's what gives you the flavor and that's what gives you the texture. So you need to complete the temperature change, and you need to complete the evaporation before you can ever get to the browning. Which is why it's it's not so important, the starting temperature of the steak, but the starting moisture of the steak is very, very important, of the exterior. So so the starting temperature of the steak has very little effect on how it cooks. What really matters is the starting moisture level of the steak. So if you want a perfect sear on a steak, the best thing to do to it actually is to take it and leave it out uncovered. I put it on a rack in the fridge and let it sit uncovered at least overnight until it looks kind of dry on the outside. And you'll sear. I mean, and you try it side by side with a freshly cut steak, and it sears probably in about a quarter to a third of the time. And it develops a much darker, browner crust. And obviously, it's important to sear fast, because the longer you spend over high heat, the more you're going to start overcooking those outer layers. And to me, that's an important thing in a steak. I want as much sort of medium rare center as possible to contrast with that crust. The other interesting thing, though, is that some people will say that it's not about searing; it's about evenness of cooking. You want to let the steak out to rest so that the internal temperature can come up. If you have a steak that's that's say like 1.5 inches thick or so, it takes a very, very long time for that internal temperature to come up. You know, room temperature is not actually that much warmer than fridge temperature. A fridge is like 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Room temperature is probably 65 degrees Fahrenheit. You can take a steak, an 1.5 inch thick steak that's at 38, 39 degrees, leave it out at room temperature for an hour, and it'll still only rise by about 4 degrees in the center. It's a very, very small difference. So anyhow, don't bother resting your steaks before cooking them. And dry is more important than warm. Okay, so this one everybody's heard. Searing meat locks in juices. This one has been around for hundreds of years and has also been disproven for hundreds of years. So the idea is that when you have a steak. So the internal structure of a steak, it looks basically like a long series, the muscle fibers are these long tubes that are kind of bundled together. So like a steak is basically just a bundle of tubes, like the internet. And as you cook it, those tubes start to squeeze out, and they'll squeeze out moisture. So let's say my steak is resting, I don't know, my steak is like this, here's my pan, it's resting like that, the tubes kind of run up and down. So the idea is that by searing one side, you're basically cauterizing all those openings on the tubes so that later juices can't bleed out of them. It's not true, and it's really easy to prove to yourself. Just take like a relatively thin steak, and I'm sure you've probably all seen this before anyway. Take a relatively thin steak, put it on your grill or in a pan, give it a really nice hard sear, and then flip it over and just wait a few minutes, and you're going to see juices start bubbling up through that surface that you seared that was supposedly sealed. It's clearly not sealed. So the question is, how much is it not sealed? The answer is it's very much not sealed. This is a graph I made of a prime rib, and so for this one, I basically cooked 2 prime ribs side by side. One of them I seared before finishing in the oven. So I did a 2-stage cooking process. There was searing at a high temperature and slow roasting in the oven to bring the internal temperature up to the final serving temperature. So I did it 2 ways. One of them I seared first, and then slowly roasted in the oven. The other one I did the reverse. I slowly roasted in the oven and then seared it at the end. So if it's true that searing seals in juices, then the one that you seared at the beginning should actually end up losing less moisture than the one that you sear at the end. And in fact, it turns out that the opposite is the case. You lose less moisture by slow roasting and then finishing with a sear. And this is true whether you're doing a prime rib. It's true whether you're cooking a steak. It's true whether you're cooking a hamburger or a pork chop or a turkey. It's true basically about any kind of meat. And it's because, it's all just because that the searing becomes much more efficient. You can sear much faster once the meat is already relatively dry on the surface because it's been roasting for a long time, and once it's at and in this case it actually is at a relatively high temperature. It'll be at 100, if you're cooking in a 275 degree oven, it'll probably be at about 200 degrees on the surface already. And so both of those things contribute to making it more efficient to sear at the end. And you actually end up with a juicier prime rib or a juicier steak. This is a method, I actually first developed this when I was at Cooks Illustrated, and there we called it the reverse sear. So if you're going to do it for a steak, what you would do is you would take your steak, put it on a rack, put it in a low temperature oven, like 225, 250 degrees, and then cook it until it's just about 5 to 10 degrees within your final target temperature. So if you want a medium rare 125 degree steak, you would cook it up to about 110 degrees or so in the oven, take it out, and then sear it and serve it. The whole idea developed from the process of sous vide cooking, which I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with by now. Sous vide cooking has been around since the 1970s, and the idea there is that you take meat or whatever it is. Generally, it's meat because it works. It's not that useful for vegetables. You will take your meat and put it in a vacuum-sealed bag, and then dip that bag into a water bath that's held precisely at the temperature that you want to serve the meat at. So you would take a 125 degree water bath with a controller and dip your meat into there, and then cook it for anywhere between 45 minutes to up to 4 hours or so, because you get, that's one of the advantages of sous vide, is you have this huge window of time before the quality of the meat starts to deteriorate. And then before you serve it, you take it out, sear it, perfectly cooked edge to edge, really nice sear. So yeah, the reverse sear is basically sort of poor man's sous vide at home. It works really well. For any kind of meat. Yes, there we go. Okay, Myth number 3, bone-in steak has more flavor than boneless. Okay, so this one seems logical to me also. When I get a ribeye, I always want to have it with the bone in. First of all, because it looks way cooler. Secondly, because those tastiest bits of meat are around that bone. Like that. When you're done with the ribeye and you start chewing on the bone, like that's always the best part. So it kind of makes sense that like with the bone, it's just going to taste better, right? So the real question was, does the bone actually add flavor to the rest of the meat? And a lot of people say that it does. This never actually really made much sense to me because if you think about the structure of meat inside, it's not just like a sack of fluid that's flowing around. It really is like this rigidly defined set of tubes that each have their own juices inside. So how would flavor from the bones get into the meat? So easy way to test this. So I roasted a few prime ribs side by side, or maybe these are steaks. No, it looks like 2 bones each. So the one on the right, is just bone in. The one in the middle, I cut off the bones and then tied them back on with no barrier. And then the one on the left, I cut off the bones and tied them back on with some aluminum foil in between. So there's absolutely no way that there's any exchange of juices. Cooked them all exactly the same way, and then did a blind taste test with a whole bunch of tasters. You can't taste the difference in any of them. They all taste identical. What you can taste the difference, though, is if you have a completely boneless steak and cook it like this and then cut a piece of meat out of the same section of the steak, it will taste different than a steak that has bones in. So the question is, why does it do that? Because obviously it's not that there's flavor being exchanged between them, which this proves. It turns out that the reason a bone-in steak does taste a little bit better than a boneless steak around that area is because a bone is a really good insulator. It prevents that area from overcooking, and so the less overcooked steak you have, the better. And so the areas around the bone stay a little bit more tender, they stay a little bit more rare, and for most people that's a good thing. So of course there's a couple of good reasons to use a bone-in steak. It's not because of flavor, but it is because of the texture of that meat near the bone. It'll cook a little bit slower, and then obviously the bone itself has connective tissue and stuff on it that tastes good when you eat it, and it looks cool again. So bones don't add steak, but they do add other things to your steak. Sorry, bones don't add flavor, but they do add other important things to your steak. Now, okay, myth number 4, flip your steak only once. This one, well, it's something that, oops, did I do that again? So this is one you hear both from restaurant cooks and from sort of backyard cooks alike, and sometimes to the point of violence. Like no, you're at your friend's grill or your uncle's grill, and they're cooking a steak, and then you come over and maybe you just want to poke it and see what's up, and then you get yelled at don't touch that steak. It hasn't been. You can't flip it until the middle. This one, I think there actually is a very good explanation for where this idea came from. First of all, I'm gonna talk about whether it's good or not. It's super easy to test. You can do this yourself at home. All of these you can do yourself at home. Super easy to test. Just get identical steaks, cook them, one flipping repeatedly every 15, 30 seconds, and one flipping only once in the middle. What you'll find is that not only does the one that you flip repeatedly brown just as well as the one that you flip only once, it'll also cook faster. It'll cook about 30% faster, and it'll cook more evenly. I don't know how easy it is to see the color on these slides, but if you can see the one on the left, so the one on the left is one that was flipped only once. And both of them have a really nice pink medium rare center. The one on the left has a relatively large sort of gray band of that overcooked meat on the outside, whereas the one on the right, which was flipped multiple times, is much more evenly cooked from edge to center. And this is one that's a little bit harder to explain without having a diagram. If you go Google this, you can find computer models of the thermodynamics inside the steak and what's going on with the heat transfer. But essentially what it is that the more often you flip your steak, eventually you're sort of approaching a situation where you're basically cooking it at a slightly lower temperature from both sides simultaneously, and that is a much more efficient way to cook your steak, and a much more even way to cook your steak than it is to try and do one side and then the other. So the one downside of flipping multiple times is if you're cooking outdoors and you really like the look of grill marks. then maybe you want to only flip once, or maybe flip and do the quarter turn thing. I think a better approach to that is to just train yourself not to care about the grill marks, because to me, when I see grill marks on a steak, you know, we do have this like this mental thing where it's like that's what a steak is supposed to look like, so it must taste good. And you know, and we don't just taste things with our tongues and with our nose. We taste things with our brain. Like, you know, taste is not just your sensory input; it's the way you interpret that input in your brain. And so you know, experience and marketing and all of these things can affect the way you interpret those signals in your brain. And so we have been conditioned to think that steaks with grill marks are superior steaks. These days, when I see a steak with grill marks, what I see is like a steak that has some sections that are overcooked and then some sections that are undercooked. And I would much rather just have like an even mahogany golden brown all over my steak. And you find that, you know, if you flip a steak repeatedly on the grill, that's what you end up with. And I think it looks better and tastes better that way. So how did this myth get started? So I can't prove this theory, but my theory is that that like a lot of cooking myths start because they're ideas that were started in restaurants and then passed on to home cooks. Like people say, oh, like at the great steakhouses they use these gigantic broilers and they flip the sticks only once. I want to make my steak like they do at the steakhouse because they must know what they're doing. What we forget is that the restrictions and the parameters of how you're operating in a steakhouse is very, very different from what you're doing at home. If you're a cook at a steakhouse, you're probably cooking 40 steaks at a time. You're not cooking 1 or 2 or 3. You're cooking many. And so it's literally impossible to flip steaks repeatedly. And you know, and having worked in restaurants, I know, like for me, the best way to stay organized is to keep track of things like that. Like I know this section I put on here. Once I flip them once, they're about halfway done. It helps you stay mentally organized. And so I think in a steakhouse, that's the reason why you flip once. It's because it helps you stay organized as a cook. It helps you ensure that that all the steaks are going to come out identical. At home, you don't have that restriction. So I think it's actually much easier to cook. It's easy to cook a steak that's better than anything you can get in a steakhouse. At home, because you don't have those restrictions. You can flip as many times as you want. You can cook it to exactly the temperature that you want. All these things. So yes, flipping multiple times, better. I think better. But again, if your uncle is at the grill and he's holding like the spatula in one hand and the knife in the other, then you don't argue with him. Season your steak. Okay, so this is about when you salt a piece of meat when you're cooking it. Some chefs will tell you not to season until the very end. Some chefs will tell you, oh, sprinkle some salt in the bottom of a cast iron pan and then put the steak in it there. Again, a very easy one to test. What you find is that so salt actually has a very interesting reaction with meat. Salt is not just about seasoning. It doesn't just add flavor or enhance flavor. It also actually changes the texture and changes actually the structure, the physical structure of a piece of meat as it interacts with it. So if anyone was at the class yesterday, we did a demonstration where I talked about why salt is important in a sausage. And the reason it's important is that salt will actually dissolve some of the muscle proteins, mainly a protein called myosin. And once that protein has been dissolved, it has a number of effects. So in the case of sausage, it allows you to then it allows the proteins to tangle up with each other much more easily, so that you get a much sort of tighter, juicier, bouncier structure in a sausage. And that's why salt is important in a sausage. In the case of a piece of meat like this. How many people here like brine their turkeys for Thanksgiving, or brine a chicken breast before grilling it? So the reason brining works is because of that. It breaks down this this protein called myosin. Myosin is one of the proteins that's responsible for this sort of squeezing action that you do to the tube. So if you think about the steak again as a bunch of tubes. Think about them as sort of like toothpaste tubes, where you're just kind of squeezing them from one end, liquid is coming out the other. So usually you're squeezing them from the bottom because that's where the heat is coming. Liquid is going to be pushed up and sort of trickle out the top a little bit. Just like a tube of toothpaste, like once that juice has been squeezed out, you can't get it back inside. And the amount of liquid that you squeeze out is directly related to the temperature that you cook the meat to. So what the salt does and what brining does is it makes it so that those tubes just don't squeeze as hard. And that's why a turkey that has been brined or a chicken breast that is brined will retain more juices than a turkey breast or a chicken that has been cooked at the same temperature without brining. The interesting part is that you don't actually need the brine. You don't need the liquid part of the brine. All you really need is the salt. And this is true whether you're cooking a steak or a turkey breast or a chicken breast. If you salt it in advance, what you're initially going to see is that the salt is going to pull out some water through osmosis. It's going to pull out a little bit of that water, and then it's going to dissolve in that water, and it'll form its own sort of super concentrated brine right on the surface of that meat. Then that brine will start to affect the structure of the meat, break down the myosin, and as those muscle fibers then sort of loosen up, the salt and everything else gets reabsorbed, and so you end up seasoning more deeply, and then you also, the longer you let it sit, the further it'll slowly work its way down into the meat. You end up seasoning more deeply, and then you also end up helping the meat retain more moisture as it cooks. This is, I don't have the video here, but you try this with a steak at home. Just put a little piece of steak out on a rack, season it with salt, and then just watch it for about 45 minutes or so. Just stare at it intently for 45 minutes. And you'll see this happen. You'll see it'll get moisture on the top first, and then eventually that moisture will disappear. And that's when you want to cook your steak, once it's absorbed all that salt and all that moisture. So when I season my steaks, I'll either do it immediately. If I'm in a rush, I'll do it immediately before cooking, or I'll season it and let it sit at least 45 minutes. Overnight is even better. Yes. Okay. So myth number 6: using a fork to turn your steaks will cause it to lose juices. So at restaurants I worked in, forks and tongs were forbidden on the line. Like you were only allowed to use your fingers and spatulas because, well, part of the idea with the forks is that if you stab your meat when you're cooking it, you're gonna lose juices. This idea again, like it didn't really quite make sense to me because it's similar to that bone thing. It's like why are we treating the steak like it's a water balloon, right? It's not just like a sack of fluid where everything flows freely and we puncture it once and then like everything's gone. As it turns out, you can stab a steak a lot before it loses any significant amount of juices. Most of the time, when you stab a steak with a fork, you're not actually going to break many of the muscle fibrils. You're basically just going to spread them apart a little bit, and that's where the fork kind of pushes its way in between them. So it's like if you have, those knife blocks that are like a whole bunch of little plastic straws, and you stick your knife into it, and it kind of spreads them apart. And that's basically what's happening when you stick a fork into a steak. Like you're pushing the muscle fibers apart. Maybe you're puncturing a few of them, losing a little bit of juice, but it's not really that detectable. So we did an experiment where we stabbed a steak with a fork, everywhere from 0 times up to 256. So 64 times with a 4-pronged fork. So 256 holes in a half-pound steak. We cooked them all side by side. You can get up to about like 128 stabs before you start really seeing significant drying out. So unless you're doing that flipping repeated thing and you're doing it like every second with like a 6-pronged fork for the entire time that you're cooking it, like you're probably okay just stabbing your steak. Of course, if you don't want to, your tongs I find easier to do anyway. But nobody's going to complain, or people might complain, but nobody should complain if you stab your steak with a fork. Similarly, if you want to, if you find yourself, God forbid, without a thermometer, and you want to know when your steak is done. You can cut it open and peek with a knife, and it's not going to completely destroy the steak. So yes, not true. And here we go. So this is myth number 7, and this might even, I think this might be the most well promoted myth. Steak myth of all time. This one and this one almost always comes from chefs when you see them talking on TV about steak, about poking your meat to see when it's done. You're cooking a steak. How are you going to tell it's done? You poke it. And so what they'll say is like, all right, so if it's there's a couple different methods. So there's like if it's there's the finger method. So like this is rare, and this is medium, and this is well done. And then there's also like the face method where it's like this is rare, and this is medium, and this is well done. There's some problems here. I think that there's some very obvious problems here. So the first one is like try this. Just everybody like poke your cheek, right? Just to get an idea of what a medium rare steak is. And now poke the cheek of the person sitting next to you. right? And it's a completely different feeling, right? I guarantee you, like, no two people in this room have the exact same cheek feel. And so the question is, like, who here has the real medium rare cheek? I think it's a really bad method. And on top of that, not every steak is going to be the same. Just like people are different, steers, cows are different from each other. They're not going to all be exactly the same, depending on what part of the steer the steak comes from, depending on how the steer was raised, what its diet was. There's all these factors that are going to change the specific texture of the one steak that you're cooking. So this is a method that if you work in a restaurant and you're dealing with a consistent product every day, and you're doing this all the time, you're going to develop a feel for it. So you will get good at this eventually. Most people at home cook steak a few times a year at most, so you're never going to develop this feel. And you're getting your steak probably from different sources each time. So it's a much more difficult thing for a home cook to do, and I think a relatively useless way to tell when your steak is done. So I don't know why I put this here. Well, this is steak doneness. There you go. So the real way to tell when a steak is done is to use a thermometer. That way there's no questions at all. A steak at 125 degrees is medium rare every time. Doesn't matter what cut it is. Doesn't matter how you cooked it. If the center is at 125 degrees, that center of the steak is medium rare. What's actually interesting is that texturally, it'll always be medium rare. Sometimes the color can vary a lot, though, especially depending on the cooking method. If people here have cooked sous vide before, you might have noticed this weird thing where meats that are cooked sous vide, particularly a steak, like when you slice it open, they look more done than they really are, and you have to let them sit. They go through this process, this blooming process, and you have to let them sit for about 10 seconds, and then the color actually really shows through. So as people will email me sometimes saying, like, I cooked my steak to 125 degrees and it came out gray in the middle. What's going on? It's because color is not always directly related to doneness. So I always advise people, like, well, like when you take your first bite of steak, like close your eyes when you cut into it and eat it, and then that's how you judge if the steak is done to your liking or not. Like, don't look at it before you start eating it. And if you do that in a blind taste test, it's actually really interesting. What you find is that people who say they like their steaks really rare almost always actually like their steak a little bit more well done than they claim to like it. If you actually put a blindfold on them, people react to that color, but then when especially like a fatty steak, when it's a little bit more well done, a really well marbled steak, that fat gets a little bit juicier, like it liquefies a little bit more, and the texture a steak that's slightly more well done, closer to the medium side of medium rare, will actually taste juicier than a well marbled steak that is just purely rare. Anyhow, yes, use a thermometer. Okay, so the question is, okay, so now there's the obvious question: what are the best ways to cook steaks? There's a number. So for me, I think the best method for people to cook steak at home is using that reverse sear method. So if you're cooking indoors, that means starting in a low temperature oven, getting it to close to your final temperature, checked with a thermometer, and then searing it at the end. And if you're doing it on a grill, you would build a 2-zone fire in your grill. So get one side really hot, leave the other side off. I keep doing that. Leave the other side off, and put the steak over the cooler side of the grill, cover it, let it slowly come up to close to its final temperature, and then finish it off by searing. If you have okay, so this is traditional high heat cooking, and you can see like here you get that big gradient, you get that sort of bullseye pattern, which some people like that pattern. Some people like that. I know people who like that because it gives you, I guess, a different textural experience across the slice of meat. So if you like it that way, then continue cooking it that way. I prefer doing the reverse sear, which is this is what you get when you do that. So you get medium rare all the way through, nice brown crust on the outside. For me, that's what like an ideal roast or an ideal steak should look like. So once you get the steak close to the final temperature, then the question is, what's the best way to sear it? There's a few ways. So remember, like your cast iron pan or whatever is a bucket. The bigger the bucket of energy you have, the better it's going to sear. So a nice heavy cast iron skillet is a great way. If you have like a stovetop griddle that's really thick, like a slab of steel or something, that's an even better way because it'll hold more energy. Sous vide. Yeah, we talked about sous vide. I also talked about that. Oh, so this is what happens if you let your sous vide steak go for too long, by the way. It kind of turns to shreds. Okay, so pan searing, the heavier the pan, the better. If you happen to have a cool tool like this, like a torch, A buddy of mine, Dave Arnold, developed this thing. It's basically like a little handheld broiler that goes on the top of a propane torch. It helps the fuel burn more efficiently, and it diffuses the heat out over the surface. I like to use it in conjunction with a pan, so that you're really like blasting it with energy, and you get a super efficient sear on it. I think if you're doing indoors, this is like really the best method to do it. If you're doing it outdoors, I actually. I don't have slides of this because I just recently did this, but last week, and if you go like on my Instagram, you'll find it. But last week, the Adam Savage from Mythbusters. This is the coolest day ever, by the way. Like I got to meet Adam Savage from Mythbusters, and he came to my house and played with my dogs, and then we seared steaks, and it was awesome. But so we were trying to answer the question, and the video will appear on his site, like I think on June 30th. But we were trying to answer the question: is there such thing as too much energy for searing? Like, is it possible to sear a steak over too high a temperatures? So we did it a bunch of ways. We seared over a regular grill. We seared using a Searzall. We seared directly on top of a charcoal chimney, so that's where you take your charcoal chimney, fill it up with coals, light it, and then place a grill directly over the top of it and just cook without dumping the coals out into the grill first. And then the last method we tried was with an aluminum forge. So it was a forge. I mean, it was a homemade aluminum forge. So basically, like a galvanized steel bucket with a ceramic lining. You fill it with coals, and then there's a zinc pipe that goes in, and you blow air into it with an air dryer, with a hair dryer, with the cover on, and it gets hot enough to melt aluminum. So it gets aluminum melts at 1,200 degrees. It was probably around 1,500 degrees or so, and so we seared on top of there. It turns out. You can get too hot to sear a steak. Of all those methods, directly on top of the charcoal chimney was the best method to our taste. All of them were good, but if you want to sear like a sous vide, if you want to finish a sous vide steak outside on the grill, I would recommend directly over the top of a chimney. It takes about, let's see, it took about a minute per side on the regular grill. A minute per side on the regular grill, like I think 2 minutes per side with the Searzall, and then about a minute and a half total with the chimney starter. It was 10 seconds per side with the forge, and it was already burnt by then. But yeah, charcoal chimney I think is the best way to sear your steak at the end. Then this seems to have stopped. That way. Okay, then the final question before you serve your steak is to rest the meat or not to rest the meat. There's arguments on both sides of this camp. So there's a few advantages to resting. One of them is that you lose less juice when you cut into the steak, and this is particularly true with larger roasts. There's a couple reasons for this. Part of it is the distribution of the juices within the meat. As the meat rests, the juices distribute themselves more evenly so that there's less pressure in certain areas. Part of it is also that the juices will gain a little bit of viscosity as they start to cool down slightly. The problem with resting, though, is that for a lot of people, it feels like you're eating lukewarm meat once you've let your steak rest for 5 minutes, mainly because the surface gets cool. There's actually not that big of a difference in internal temperature change, and with something like a large roast, your internal temperature is actually going to rise a little bit because the energy that's on the outside of the steak is slowly still traveling in even after you pull it out of the oven. So it's really about that surface temperature, that sort of crackling crust. You lose that if you let the steak. If you let the steak rest too long. So how do you get the best of both worlds? This is the method I use. I let my steaks rest, and then I just reheat the outer surface again. So if I'm doing it on a grill outside, I take it off the grill, let it rest. Just before serving it, like throw it back on high heat for about like 15 seconds per side just to get it nice and crusty. If you're doing it inside, you're searing it in a pan. You're gonna have this pan of hot juices like oil, fat rendered from the steak. All that stuff tastes good. It's also really great at giving your steak a nice crispy, hot crust again at the end. So you let your steak rest on a rack, reheat those juices until they're smoking hot, and then just pour them over the steak. Gets nice and crispy, and sizzles. It smells great. It makes everything taste better. And you have rested meat that also has a crispy crust. So you don't have to settle for just one. That's what a good steak looks like. I think that's a good steak. And that's it. So that is what I came to talk about today. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming today. I hope you had fun.